For years, a group of geneticists ran one of the biggest genetic comparisons ever attempted. They took thousands of DNA samples from people across China and thousands more from across Europe, then fed everything into powerful sequencing machines built to read billions of genetic letters at once. The goal sounded simple. Compare two of the largest population groups on Earth and see exactly how different they really are. But what came out of that analysis left even the scientists running it staring at their screens in disbelief. If you enjoy deep dives into science that challenge what we think we already know, stick around and subscribe, because this channel breaks down discoveries like this every single week. Now let's get into what the data actually showed. The project pulled genetic material from major population clusters across East Asia and Europe. Researchers gathered samples from northern Chinese provinces, southern Chinese communities, coastal populations, and inland groups, then matched them against samples from Scandinavia, the Mediterranean, Western Europe, and Eastern Europe. Every sample went through the same sequencing pipeline so the results could be compared side by side without bias. When the first numbers came back, the researchers noticed something that seemed almost impossible to believe. Despite obvious differences in appearance, skin tone, eye shape, hair texture, bone structure, a person from Beijing and a person from Berlin share more than 99% of their entire genetic code. The two groups that look the most visually distinct among all human populations are, at the level of DNA, almost identical. That tiny sliver of difference, less than 1% of the genome, is where the entire story of human variation lives. And once scientists zoomed into that small fraction, the discoveries got stranger and far more interesting. The first surprise came when researchers mapped out where the real genetic diversity was hiding. Most people assume that if you compare a huge country like China against an entire continent like Europe, China would show less internal variety since it is often treated as one giant population. The data proved the opposite. The genetic diversity found within China alone, from the far north down to the southern coastal regions, was larger than many researchers expected, in some cases even rivaling the genetic spread across several European countries combined. A person from a northern Chinese province could be genetically more different from someone in southern China than a Spaniard is from a Pole. This happens because China was never one single ancestral group that simply grew larger over time. It represents dozens of ancient populations that expanded, mixed with neighboring groups, absorbed migrants, and unified under shared culture, language, and government across thousands of years of history. The idea of a single unified Chinese gene pool turned out to be a cultural story more than a biological one. Europe told a similar tale, just through a different set of events. Ancient DNA, extracted from skeletons across the continent, showed that the earliest hunter-gatherers who lived in Europe tens of thousands of years ago were almost completely replaced by farming populations that migrated in from Anatolia, in what is now modern-day Turkey, around 9,000 years ago. Then a second wave arrived a few thousand years later, herders sweeping in from the grasslands north of the Black Sea, bringing new tools, new languages, and new genetic material with them. Modern Europeans are a blend of these three very different ancestral groups, none of whom thought of themselves as European, because that identity did not exist yet. So when scientists lined up Chinese and European genomes side by side, they were not comparing two pure, ancient, unchanging populations. They were comparing two enormous genetic mixtures, each shaped by thousands of years of migration, war, trade, and blending with neighboring groups. The next major discovery focused on the traits people usually associate with race in the first place: skin color, eye shape, and hair texture. Researchers found that the genes responsible for these physical features make up an incredibly small portion of the total human genome, a fraction so tiny it barely registers next to the rest of our DNA. Yet these are the traits humans have used for centuries to sort each other into categories, build hierarchies, and justify discrimination. Even more surprising was how recently many of these traits actually appeared. The genetic mutation responsible for lighter skin in European populations is believed to have spread widely only around 8,000 years ago, a blink of an eye compared to the roughly 300,000 years modern humans have existed. The distinct eye shape, common across East Asian populations, developed through its own separate genetic pathway, unrelated to any of the genes involved in European skin tone. These are not signs of two fundamentally different kinds of humans. They are localized, recent adaptations layered on top of a shared ancestral foundation. Meanwhile, the genetic systems that actually matter for health, brain function, immune response, and metabolism showed something far more important. These traits varied enormously within each population group, not neatly between them. A person's risk for certain diseases, their metabolic efficiency, or their cognitive potential cannot be predicted by looking at their ethnicity. The genes controlling these traits are scattered across all human populations, without respecting the racial lines people drew centuries ago. Researchers also studied why certain physical traits appeared in one region and not another, and the explanation kept coming back to environment rather than any deep biological divide. Populations that settled in regions with intense sun exposure evolved darker skin as protection against ultraviolet radiation. Populations that moved into northern latitudes with weaker sunlight evolved lighter skin, which allows better vitamin D production in low light conditions. The distinctive eyelid shape common in East Asian populations may have offered protection against cold wind and the glare of snow and ice, useful for ancestors who lived through harsh winters in parts of ancient Asia. These changes happened independently, shaped by whatever environment a population found itself living in. Scientists call this process convergent evolution, when different groups arrive at similar physical solutions through completely separate genetic routes, simply because they faced similar environmental pressures. It is the same reason unrelated animals like dolphins and sharks both evolved streamlined bodies for swimming efficiently through water, despite one being a mammal and the other a fish. Similar problems, similar solutions, different starting points. One of the most fascinating twists in the data came from studying disease resistance. Certain genetic conditions do show up more often in specific population groups, and at first glance this seems to support old ideas about race having a genetic basis. But when researchers dug deeper, they found the real explanation had nothing to do with race and everything to do with local history. Take lactose tolerance as an example. The ability to digest milk into adulthood is common in parts of Europe, where dairy farming became widespread thousands of years ago. But it is also found in certain pastoral communities in East Africa and Central Asia, groups that historically raised livestock for milk, and it is largely absent in many East Asian populations who never built their food systems around dairy farming. This trait spread based on culture and lifestyle, not according to any racial category. Populations that started herding animals for milk developed the genetic tools to digest it, regardless of where on the map they happened to live. A similar pattern appeared with disease resistance linked to malaria. Certain genetic variants that offer partial protection against malaria became common in populations from regions where the disease was historically widespread, spanning parts of Africa, the Mediterranean, and areas of Asia with high malaria exposure. The mutation spread because it helped people survive in malaria-heavy environments, not because of anything tied to a racial identity. Two people from completely different parts of the world, sorted into entirely different racial categories by outdated systems, could carry the exact same protective mutation simply because their ancestors both lived somewhere malaria was a constant threat. This flips the old assumption on its head. Disease patterns linked to specific populations are not proof that race is biologically real. They are proof that evolution responds to local environmental pressure, no matter what group of people happens to be living there. Researchers found more examples once they started looking beyond the obvious cases. High-altitude survival turned out to be one of the clearest illustrations of this pattern. Populations living on the Tibetan Plateau developed genetic changes that let their bodies use oxygen far more efficiently at extreme elevations, something lowland populations struggle with even after months of acclimatization. Thousands of miles away, populations living high in the Andes Mountains in South America developed their own separate genetic solution to the exact same problem. Both groups can function normally at altitudes that would cause serious health problems for almost anyone else on the planet, yet they arrived at that ability through completely different genetic pathways, shaped by thousands of years living in similarly extreme environments. Neither group borrowed the solution from the other. Both simply evolved independently to survive where they lived. This pattern kept repeating everywhere scientists looked. Populations living near the Arctic Circle developed metabolic adaptations that helped their bodies process the extremely high-fat diets common in traditional cold climate lifestyles. Populations living at high altitudes in East Africa developed a completely different set of adaptations related to endurance and oxygen efficiency, useful for the thin air and rugged terrain of the region. None of these traits map neatly onto any racial category. They map onto geography, climate, diet, and thousands of years of local pressure. The deeper researchers dug, the clearer it became that genetic variation follows environment and history, not the racial boundaries humans invented on paper. A population is shaped by the mountains it settled in, the food it learned to grow or hunt, the diseases it was forced to survive, and the neighbors it eventually mixed with. None of that lines up with simple categories like Chinese or European, Asian, or white. Those labels are cultural shorthand, useful for talking about shared language, history, or nationality, but almost meaningless when you look directly at the genome. Perhaps the most mind-bending discovery from this kind of research involves how recently all human populations were actually connected. Genetic modeling suggests that if you trace back far enough, every single person alive today shares a common ancestor who lived only a few thousand years ago. Go back roughly 7,000 years. The models show something even more remarkable. Everyone alive on Earth today descends from the exact same group of ancestors who were alive at that time. Every ancient farmer working fields along the Yellow River, every ancient herder in the grasslands of Eastern Europe, If they left descendants who survived until today, every person alive right now is one of those descendants. This means the idea of one population being descended from a single, pure, ancient lineage completely falls apart. Nobody's family tree is a straight, single line reaching back to one ancient group. Every person's ancestry is a massive tangled web reaching into thousands of different ancestral populations across the entire planet. The only reason anyone feels more connected to one branch of that tree than another comes down to culture, language, and family stories passed down through generations, not biology. Genetic researchers found more surprising connections when they traced ancient migration routes in detail. Some populations in northern China carry genetic markers linked to ancient groups that once lived much further north, in regions now part of Siberia and Mongolia. Southern Chinese populations show genetic signatures connecting them to ancient populations that also contributed to groups across Southeast Asia and even into the Pacific. Meanwhile, European populations carry genetic traces reaching back to farmers who once lived in what is now the Middle East, alongside herders whose ancestors came from the vast steppe regions stretching from Eastern Europe into Central Asia. None of these ancient groups thought of themselves in the racial or national categories we use today. They were simply people moving toward better land, following herds, fleeing conflict, or searching for resources. Over thousands of years, their descendants mixed, spread, and settled into the regions we now associate with modern nations and ethnic identities. The lines we draw on maps today came long after the genetic mixing that shaped the people living inside those borders. Researchers studying ancient burial sites across China found something that added even more weight to this picture. Skeletal remains from different regions and different time periods showed genetic signatures that shifted gradually over thousands of years as farming communities expanded, as trade routes opened between regions, and as different dynasties unified territories that had once been separate kingdoms with their own languages and customs. The Han Chinese identity, often treated today as one single ethnic group, turned out to represent a genetic blending of northern and southern populations that merged together over an enormous span of history, shaped as much by politics, agriculture, and administration as by ancestry. A similar process shaped identity across Europe. Long before anyone used the word European to describe themselves, the people living on that landmass spoke different languages, followed different customs, and had genetically distinct backgrounds, depending on whether their ancestors came from early farming communities, steppe herding cultures, or older hunter-gatherer groups that had lived there for tens of thousands of years. The shared European identity that exists today grew out of politics, religion, trade, and colonial history far more than it grew out of any single unified bloodline. This raises an important question about identity itself. If genetic ancestry is this tangled and this mixed for almost every population on the planet, then what people call their ethnic or national identity is really a story built on culture, shared language, and shared history, layered on top of a genome that does not respect any of those boundaries. The story we tell about who we are and where we come from is real and meaningful to the people who live it, but it is a cultural story, not a biological one. So if the DNA shows so much overlap, so much shared ancestry, and so little actual biological division, where did the idea of separate fixed races come from in the first place? Historians trace the modern concept of race back to European scholars in the 1700s and 1800s, who tried to sort human populations into rigid categories the same way naturalists were classifying plants and animals at the time. These early classification systems ranked human groups by supposed levels of civilization, intelligence, and worth, almost always placing the classifier's own population at the top of the list. These rankings were used to justify colonization, forced labor, and the destruction of entire cultures around the world. The scientists behind these systems claimed they were following pure observation and logic, but their conclusions were shaped heavily by the politics and prejudices of their era. Differences in technology, government systems, and culture, which came from historical circumstances like geography, climate, and access to resources, were wrongly explained away as permanent biological differences between groups of people. Modern genetics has completely dismantled that old framework. The traits early race scientists obsessed over, skin tone, facial structure, hair type, show no connection whatsoever to intelligence, morality, or human worth. The genetic differences that do exist between population groups are either neutral or represent adaptations to local environments, nothing more. None of it supports ranking any group as superior or inferior to another. Maybe the most important thing this kind of DNA comparison reveals is not what scientists found, but what they consistently failed to find. Across every study comparing Chinese populations to European populations, researchers never found evidence supporting fixed, separate biological races. They never found genetic proof that one population is more advanced or more evolved than another. What they found instead is one single human species, with a shared and surprisingly recent common history, whose visible differences make up an almost invisible fraction of the genetic code we all carry. None of this erases the real-world impact that ideas about race have had throughout history. Social categories built around race have shaped who has access to opportunity, wealth, education, and power for centuries. And those effects are still very real today. Understanding that race has no solid genetic foundation does not undo the lived experience of people who have faced discrimination because of how they look. What it does mean is that nobody can hide behind the excuse of natural biological difference to explain away inequality. There is no DNA-based justification for why one group should have more resources, more opportunity, or more power than another. The gaps we see in wealth, health, and opportunity come from historical and social systems that people built, not from any built-in genetic destiny. There's one more angle to this story that researchers found particularly striking: the question of what happens when populations that were separated for thousands of years come back into contact. Throughout history, trade routes like the ancient Silk Road connected communities across Central Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, creating corridors where genes moved along with goods, ideas, and language. Genetic traces of these ancient trade routes still show up in the DNA of populations living along the old paths today, small signatures of contact between groups that modern nations often describe as completely separate and unrelated. Even isolated seeming populations rarely stayed isolated for long once you look far enough back. Communities living in remote mountain valleys or on small islands often show evidence of contact with neighboring groups going back many centuries, even when local traditions describe them as untouched or unmixed. Genetic isolation, in the strict sense of a population that never received any outside genetic material for thousands of years, turned out to be almost non-existent once researchers studied enough samples. Humans have always moved, traded, intermarried, and mixed, even when the written history of a region suggests strict separation between groups. This constant blending is not a modern invention driven by air travel or the internet. It has been the normal pattern of human history since our species first began spreading across the globe. What has changed in the modern era is not the fact of mixing itself, but the speed and scale at which it now happens, and the visibility of it thanks to modern genetic testing that lets ordinary people trace ancestry connections their grandparents never knew existed. Taken together, everything this research revealed points toward the same conclusion from multiple different directions. Physical appearance is controlled by a tiny sliver of the genome. That tiny sliver changed recently and independently in different populations, responding to local environments. The traits that actually matter for health and ability are spread across all populations, without respecting any racial boundary. Every population studied turned out to be a mixture of older populations, blended together through migration and contact repeated over thousands of years. And every person alive today, no matter where their ancestors lived, connects back to the same recent shared ancestral pool if you trace the family tree back far enough. None of this makes the differences between cultures, languages, and lived experiences any less real or any less worth understanding and respecting. People raised in different regions of China and different regions of Europe grew up with different languages, different food traditions, different family structures, and different histories that shaped how they see the world. Those cultural differences are genuine, valuable, and worth preserving and celebrating. What the genetic data shows is simply that none of those cultural differences are rooted in some fixed, unchangeable biological division between groups of people. Culture is learned and passed down. Biology, at least when it comes to something as broad and old as race, does not draw the lines that culture has drawn. The scientists who ran these massive comparisons between Chinese and European populations gave the world something valuable, hard genetic evidence that strips away centuries of false assumptions about human difference. They prove that underneath surface-level features, we are remarkably alike. They show that human variation is a story of migration, adaptation, and mixing, not a ladder ranking one group above another. And they confirmed, one more time, using the most advanced tools modern science has ever had, that every person on this planet belongs to the exact same human family, with roots that stretch back to the very same place, and a story still being written together. What we choose to do with that knowledge is entirely up to us.